This morning, a special panel on the stalled negotiations to raise the nation's debt ceiling. So who is to blame? Republicans accuse the Democrats. Democrats say it's the GOP's fault. But who do Americans blame? Joining us to answer questions from our group of independent voters is Margaret Hoover. She worked in the White House for President George W. Bush. She's also author of American Individualism, How a New Generation of Conservatives Can Save the Republican Party, on her first book tour. Having a good time, she says. Also with us, the senior political columnist for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, John Avlon. And in the interest of full disclosure, he is her husband. This is true. Good morning to both of you. Thanks for coming. I want to thank you guys for coming as well, getting up early on a Saturday morning. Let me ask the group a question first up, and raise your hand if you feel this way. How many are you surprised, that Washington has taken so long to come up with a deal on this? Nobody's surprised on that. That's interesting to you guys?
Are you listening, Washington? Yeah.
Second question I have for you. Again, raise your hand. Who thinks that politicians are more concerned with their party's agenda than they are with the opinions of the American people?
Absolutely.
Just about everybody. Just about everybody. Again, are you listening, Washington?
Yeah.
What is going on? Why do you think so many people feel this way?
Because there's a huge disconnect. The two parties are deeply polarized and the American people are not. And there's an increasing sense of frustration about people putting special interests ahead of the national interest. And I think this whole debt ceiling debate is becoming a symbol of that.
But let's not forget either that there are principled decisions between the two parties, differences between the two parties and how to handle the fiscal future of the country. And Republicans are saying, look, we can't just raise the debt ceiling without making real structural reforms. And some would argue that if the Republicans hadn't come to town, we would have just raised the debt ceiling like we have time and time and time again.
An interview last hour with Senator Ron Johnson. I don't know if you guys saw that, but he clearly had his position. He's standing firm. On the other side, you can see Democrats doing the exact same thing. Will anything ever get done if both sides feel this way?
Well, I think you're exactly right. To the whole point of who's to blame, we need to stop pointing fingers at each other and start getting solutions. And I think that's what we're here to talk about.
Okay, let's see if we can find out. Susan has our first question. Susan, you go ahead.
Okay, well, we've all heard about the dire consequences that will ensue if they don't raise the debt ceiling. However, I'd like to know why at all are the politicians against reducing the debt while raising the debt ceiling?
John, you want to handle that one?
Sure. I mean, well, look, you're exactly right. We have two fundamental problems. We have this debt ceiling that we're rushing towards on August 2nd, when the nation's economy really runs a risk of going off the cliff. And then we have the underlying issues of deficit and debt, and the two are being linked in an attempt to kind of create some urgency. Look, President Obama made a point yesterday. Americans voted, independent voters voted for divided government because we like checks and balances. We did not vote for dysfunction or default. And that is a major message Washington needs to understand. We have to be able to reason together.
Margaret, you want to handle some of that as well?
You know, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a gridlock, it seems to be, but it's because there's real differences. And I think I agree with you. I don't think we should just continue to raise the debt ceiling without really making some structural reforms. Just like every American around their kitchen table is having to pull back on some of the things they're spending, Washington should have to pull back on some of the things that they're spending on as well.
I'm going to go to Jack now, who has a question for Margaret. Go ahead, Jack.
So the debt ceiling's been raised consistently since 1939, with exception to President Truman. How is it that Republicans can take such a hard line on opposing this now?
Well, I think that Republicans would argue that they're reflecting the will of the electorate. Republicans, you're exactly right, have been part of the problem for a very long time. Just like Democrats, they have consistently voted to raise the debt ceiling. There was a massive historic election in 2010 that sent 87 new Republicans to the House of Representatives. The Tea Party really infused the Republican Party with a message of urgent fiscal conservatism and fiscal responsibility. And I think that's what the Republicans are reflecting right now. I think they're reflecting the will of the electorate that sent them to Washington.
Okay. Matt, you have a question for John.
Yeah, thanks. So recent polls have expressed the public's deep frustration with both of the parties in how they're handling the debate. So my question is, will the parties actually pick up on the mood of the nation and actually address the problems that are being caused by their partisanship?
Well, they certainly haven't yet. I mean, and look, independent voters like you are the largest and fastest growing segment of the electorate. That represents, I believe, a market failure in our politics. The two parties are not listening to some fundamental, really, plurality of the American people. So it really is incumbent upon them, not only if they want to win elections, but if they want to actually start saving our economy from a deeper problem, to find a way to be able to listen to independent voters and find a way to reason together. That means everyone's got to give something. And that's what we're not seeing in Washington. There's an all-or-nothing emphasis in negotiations. The American people understand that's not how you solve a problem.
Let me ask you very quickly, politically, which side has the most to lose if there's no deal? on this?
We all have a lot to lose. I mean,
the
this
country
is
has a lot to lose.
I'm talking politically. I understand
Look, I think the Republicans have a lot to lose. It's showing that public opinion is already shifting against Republicans. Unfortunately, they have but one leg in this stool of three-legged stool. So I think Republicans certainly have a lot to lose.
Yeah, I mean, and the American people do support a more balanced approach to this, an aggressive plan, but a balanced plan. So the Republicans, I do think, have a real run of risk on this.
Okay, we have more questions from our panel coming up in just a bit. Going to hear from more of our independent voters. We're coming right back. You're watching The Early Show on CBS. Good stuff, guys. And we are back with our panel that is taking up the question of who's to blame for the stalled and angry debt ceiling negotiations in the nation's capital. Answering questions from our group of independent voters, once again, is Margaret Hoover, who worked in the White House for President George W. Bush, and senior political columnist for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, John Avlon. I'm going to go to Jeff, who's standing right here. You have a question for John.
Yeah, from the beginning of the Obama presidency, the Republicans stated it was their mission to see him fail. So how can we remotely have faith that they're interested in constructive compromise or making genuine progress?
Can I answer this one?
You go ahead. You know what? I figured you wanted to talk. Go right ahead.
Here's the thing. It is true that there were some popular entertainers who have Republican audience who said, we hope Obama fails. But no Republican elected leader in the House of Representatives or the Senate today has ever said that. Not the Speaker Boehner, not the head of the Senate, Mitch McConnell. So elected representatives in positions of real responsibility have never said that. And I actually believe that our representatives, even though they have very different views on how to solve the debt crisis, do have the best interest of the country at heart.
Well, I think there's a danger when we start demonizing people who disagree with us. And I think our political debates have become so infused with that kind of vitriol that it becomes even more difficult to reason together, and something we should all be concerned about.
You happy with that answer, Jeff?
Relatively.
Okay. All right. Want to follow up anything?
Well, yeah, it seems to me that they don't have a vested interest in anything getting accomplished if it's going to possibly get him reelected, since, generally speaking, when good economies occur under a president, he gets reelected, and when they go bad, like Carter, they get unelected.
You raise a profound point, just because I do think there's some hyper-partisans who believe that the worse things get, the better for them they are politically. And I think there are folks in both parties who say, look, if things go over the cliff from the debt ceiling, we may benefit politically. That is, I think, a fundamentally sick way to view our politics. And that is a fundamental failure of an ability to think about the national interest instead of your respective special interests.
Okay, let's move on now. Thank you so much, Jeff. Candace, let me go to you. You have a question for John.
Yes. Should we be concerned that the government will, it will be harder and harder to work together in their head years because of posturing politicians?
Yes, you should. I mean, look, politics follows the lines of physics. Mm-hmm. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. And the more one side draws upon, demonizing a president of the opposite party, it's not like it's not going to happen when the next president of the opposite party comes in. So these things are cyclical. There's a cycle of incitement. And if we want to stop it, we need to stand up and say, you have an obligation to work together and reason together and punish those folks who try to polarize.
Can these guys and gals put a Band-Aid on this? I mean, when there's a next crisis 6 months from now, will this still be, the stench still be hanging over D.C.?
I think they need to listen to people like you, independent voters, who are talking about pragmatism and solutions in our politics, not partisanship. And I think the responsible elected leaders are absolutely trying to do that.
Candace, thanks a lot. Jesse, you have a question for Margaret.
Yes, I'm not an expert on the economy. Who's to blame? I'm a medical doctor. I am an expert, though. For 25 years, I've been practicing internal medicine, and I recognize disease when it's systemic and uncontrolled. And the two parties are strangling our democracy. And I believe that we as a nation have to now turn our attention to reforming the political process, to healing the political process and doing something about the partisanship. As independents, we support political reforms, comprehensive, nonpartisan restructuring of the political process. We think that's at the heart of the dysfunction in Washington. We have a whole set of prescriptions for reforms.
What's your question, Jesse? Go ahead.
What are your thoughts, your ideas on how ordinary Americans can open up the political process and change the gridlock in Washington?
Well, I think the most important thing that individual citizens can do is talk to their representatives and talk to their members of Congress. You can email them, you can call them, you can go to their town hall meetings. The blessing of America is that we live in the most open government in the world, and your representatives need to hear from you, and it makes a difference.
And look, I appreciate the frustration because you're in a situation where the Congress is deeply polarized and there's not, there are no independents serving in Congress, or not nearly enough, nothing that makes representative. So you do have to call your congressman. You need to be the change you want to see, and you need to make them feel that the incentive structure doesn't just force them to the extremes, but forces them to reason together. And the folks who have the courage to reach across the aisle, that they'll be rewarded with your support. When something like the Gang of Six comes forward with a bipartisan plan, that deserves your strong support, it seems to me.
All right. John and Margaret, we thank you very much for coming in today. To our panel as well, thank you for your great questions. Really appreciate it. Hope you got a lot out of this. We did. I'm sure our viewers did as well.